Dear friends, dear siblings, I am reading from the Bible, from the New Testament, the second letter of Paul the Apostle to Timothy, chapter 1, verse 14. Guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you. Guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit who lives in us. Guard good deposit that was entrusted to you. Guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit who lives in us. Dear friends, dear siblings, dear cousins, for many average non-Unitarian Universalist Americans, Transylvania is nothing more than the land of Dracula. And that is almost they can say about it. When I first visited the United States in 2000, I often faced with this. However, Dracula isn't our heritage. I also remember that when I was on my way home, a guy selling egg-shaped watches at the airport stopped me and asked, "Hey, ma'am, where do you come from?" When I replied, I was from Transylvania, and asked, "Do you know where it is?" He said, "I don't, but it sounds like it is very far away." The Unitarian Universalists of America, especially those who have visited Transylvania, have other stereotypes about my home. For instance, the ministers wear black and robe. They always read from the Bible when preaching. I am one of the ordained Unitarian ministers of Transylvania, but perhaps it would be more correct to say that I am an archivist rather than a minister, because I don't have own congregation. I do wear black and robe at home, of course, when I walk up to the pulpit, and I do read biblical verses before the sermon. This is our heritage. This is the treasure that we inherited from our ancestors, that we preserve and try to hand down to our descendants. When Paul the Apostle returned to Lystra after his second missionary journey, the congregation drew his attention to a young man named Timothy, whose life, faith, and love made him an example for the congregation. They saw that he had kept this faith in hard times, in times of pain, and he turned to God. In times of plenty, he gave thanks to God for the blessings he had received. They knew that he shared the love that he had received from God with the congregation and his family, and that God was not some sort of abstract reality for him, nor a distant fact, but a guidepost that he lived his life by. For this reason, the congregation considered Timothy to be a man worthy of Paul's attention, to be shown as an example for many others. Paul agreed and took Timothy along on his missions, and Timothy later became his disciple and successor in his service to God. Paul wrote letters to Timothy, 2 of which are included in the Bible. In his second letter, Paul says that Timothy's faith was without hypocrisy, just like his mothers and grandmothers, who not only spoke about the love and greatness of God, but also proved by their action how one can live in God's embrace and believe in Him. Timothy learned a very important thing from his parents: how to preserve that fine treasures that God had given him. Here and now, at this inspiring service, there are many parents and grandparents who know what a privilege and at the same time what a responsibility is to be a parent and belong to the family of the congregation as well. For it is from us that our children, grandchildren, our children in the families in the congregation can learn what to hold dear, what to consider valuable, what is important and less important in life, and also learn how to preserve the material and spiritual treasures that they have received. I think all of you can think of memories from your own lives about the love and care of your parents and grandparents, their knowledge and their responsibility to pass on to you their value systems. Many of you must feel that your parents have sealed in your hearts and the responsibility to preserve your family traditions, your material and spiritual treasures. I grew up in the museum yard of the small Hungarian town of Székelykeresztúr, which housed the treasures, the artifacts that represented the material and spiritual culture of the Székers, Hungarian nations. My grandfather was the director of the museum. My father worked there as a museologist. In this environment, my siblings and I observed love for the treasures of the past almost without noticing it. We saw our father and grandfather walking from village to village, camera in hand, to collect, to preserve values of Hungarian folk culture and exhibit them in that museum, which was a kind of garden of muses. It was meant to be a shining torch, a source of inspiration, a testimony for the generation to come. This treasure are voiceless, witnesses of times long past, which can still be made to speak. If we look at ancient carved wooden funeral monument, or a carved wooden Székely or Hungarian gate, we see the soul of the entire Hungarian nation. They say that when a Székely or Hungarian man cuts a tree, he feels sorry for it, so he starts to carve it. He works it until he carves his source into the wood. This is how the Székely wooden gate, the Hungarian wooden gate, bears the spirit of the Székely Hungarian man, becoming today a symbol of the Hungarian all over the world. They also say, az alma nem esik messze a fájától. Literally, an apple doesn't fall far from the tree, like father, like son. I also fell from my parents' tree to the ground. I might have banged myself a little, but here I stand. I can do no other with homage to Luther Martin. I try to preserve and popularize the heritage that God has entrusted to me as a human being, a minister, an archivist. As an archivist, I am responsible for working with our Unitarian written heritage from the 16th century to the present. Objects safeguarded in museums or archival documents are usually unique. Often there is only one of them, and if damaged, they are irreplaceable. They are extremely valuable, beautiful pieces of history, reminiscent of the past. We can imagine this object or documents not resting in showcases or archives, but being the accessories of daily life. They are amazing to look at, beautiful treasures. But the nicest of them all is not in front our eyes, not in showcases, not on shelves. The nicest, dearest treasure is in our heart, in our soul. The most valuable part of our lives is in our souls and hearts. That's where we preserve it. The dearest treasures of our hearts and souls, as Paul of the Apostles say, are God's words, faith in Him, and in the teaching of Jesus and love. Hold the pattern of sound words which thou hast heard from me in faith and love which is in Jesus. It is this that we all have to preserve. These are the most valuable treasures that God entrusted to us. And what we think about them is really important because our children see and follow our value systems. Timothy was recommended to Paul because people saw these values in his life and considered him a rich man for it. Timothy wasn't rich because he had much money, but because he abounded in faith and love. However, we only actually own this treasure if we preserve them. This is why the Apostle Paul tells us to do so. And that is why he told Timothy to do so as well. But how can we preserve this? This is the question. We can best preserve what is within reach, what we use on a daily basis, what is part of our everyday life. Not something distant, but something that is present in our heart and soul. For it is not enough to just talk about biblical stories, faith and love. You must live and act upon them. Our faith is in vain if our good deeds don't mirror it. And our reading of the Bible is in vain if I don't learn from it how to gain strength and how to know God more. My speech of love is in vain if I don't act accordingly. If I always lose my patience at home and shut at my loves on once. If I always talk back, say lies, or hurt other people, then the treasure is not mine yet. Receiving the treasure will not suffice. One must preserve them. There is one other thing that Paul, the apostle, emphasizes, which is even more important than those said above. And this is the permanent turn toward God. Paul says to Timothy, safeguard the treasure entrusted to you. But how? By the Holy Spirit dwelling in us. That is, if we follow the path of faith and love, even if sometimes our faith seems to be fading or lovelessness overwhelms us, we must turn to God. We are never alone because God's power, His Holy Spirit always watches over us, and with His help, we can always find a way to preserve our treasures. The black robe and the Bible, the black suit, are dear to us, Transylvanians. But what other treasures had God entrusted to us? Our Unitarian Universalist faith, which is not measured by volumes or weight, but by human attitude. It is not a treasure that can be ruined by moth or rust. But if we are not careful enough, it can easily be lost in the depth of indifference. This treasure that Jesus had bestowed upon us, Francis David, the founder of the Hungarian Unitarian Church, shared to our ancestor more than 451 years ago. It is this Unitarian treasure that our brothers engaged in religious dispute safeguarded. This is the treasures that Gáspár Heltai's printing press turned into books. Heltai was a Transylvanian Saxon Unitarian theologian, writer, and printer. The brother of his son-in-law was Francis David. This is the treasure that they wanted to burn when they threw George Enyedi's Explicaciones into the stake. This is the treasure whose brightness the atrocities of the Counter-Reformation tried to cast out. This treasure, the Unitarian Universalist faith, was preserved by our ancestors and handed down to us. Its spiritual emanation has made way everywhere and fell onto fertile ground, from the British Isles to United States of America and India, or in Philippines. William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, Theophilus Lindsay, Joseph Priestley, James Martineau, and many others, carriers of the common Unitarian roots, have also preserved this value treasure. What is this faith then? A ladder leading to God, a window through which life always seems nice and Jesus' face truly human. A milestone which shows the straight path, and hand that embrace wipes off the tears, gives strength and life up. We are all in God's hands, and that is the best place we can be. Amen.